It was the summer of 1943. A German prisoner of war stepped off a transport train somewhere in the American interior, looked out at a horizon of open farmland, clean roads, and impossible abundance, and decided, quietly and with complete conviction, that it was all a stage set. A lie built from plywood and paint. He was certain of it. And that certainty, held tightly in the chest of a man who had been told exactly what America was, would take months, sometimes years, to dissolve. Some of it never did. This is the story of what the enemy believed, what they saw, and what they finally admitted, in their own words, when the evidence became too heavy to carry. Long before the first German soldier set foot on American soil as a prisoner, the picture of America had already been drawn for him. It had been drawn carefully, with great intention, by the Reich's propaganda apparatus, and it was not a flattering portrait. America, in the telling of Joseph Goebbels and the newspapers that carried his ministry's voice, was a nation of contradictions loud, boastful, racially divided, and fundamentally soft. The industrial statistics that should have alarmed any serious military planner were either suppressed, minimized, or reframed as fabrications. A country that had spent the years between the wars retreating into isolationism, that had sent no great army into Europe in the early years of the conflict, that was separated from the real war by an ocean so wide it might as well have been a myth. What could such a place truly produce? What kind of soldier could it send? The men who would become prisoners had absorbed this portrait completely. It was not a question they had examined. It was simply the air they breathed inside the Reich. America was distant, decadent, and beatable. Its people were consumers, not fighters. Its factories produced cars and refrigerators, not the iron wool required to win a continental war. Imagine what that belief felt like from the inside. It was not arrogance exactly. It was more like the calm of a man who has already checked the map and found his destination easy. There was no reason to look again. But then the transport ships arrived, and the trains began to move west. The journey to America, for most German POWs, began in North Africa or in the Atlantic men captured during the desert campaigns, or pulled from the water after U-boat disasters, or taken on the beaches and fields of Sicily and Italy. By 1943 and into 1944, the numbers grew into the hundreds of thousands. The crossing itself was already disorienting. The Allied ships were enormous. The sailors were well-fed and unhurried. The provisions stored in the hold of a single vessel exceeded what some of these men had seen rationed across an entire unit for a month. One does not arrive at the coast of a broken nation on ships like these. That thought moved quietly through many of them, though few spoke it aloud. Then came the American coast. Then came the ports. Then came the roads leading inland. The prisoners were transported by train, and the trains passed through a country that looked nothing at all like a nation at war. The lights were on. The cities were not rubbled. The grocery stores visible from the station platforms were stocked. The automobiles moved in ordinary traffic as though somewhere far away there was no war happening at all, as though the whole arrangement of scarcity and sacrifice that defined life in Germany simply did not exist here. And so, the first defense mechanism appeared. The stage set. The performance put on for their benefit, to break their morale. Germany had told them America was struggling. The struggling America was nowhere in sight. Therefore, what they were seeing could not be real. It was a logical response, given what they had been given to think with. It was also, quietly, the first crack. The POW camps that received German prisoners across the American interior in Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, Arizona, and dozens of other states were, by Geneva Convention standards, required to be adequate. What the prisoners found was, by their own later accounts, considerably more than adequate. They were fed, not sparingly fed. The caloric content of the daily prisoner ration in American camps roughly matched the ration of an American soldier in the field. To men who had watched the German home front tighten its belt year by year, who had seen Russian prisoners in German camps starve in their thousands, this was not a small thing. It was a bewildering thing. They were housed in barracks that kept out the cold and the rain. They received medical attention. There were recreation areas. In some camps, there were libraries. In some of those libraries, there were books that had been banned in Germany for a decade, works by Jewish authors, by political dissidents, by the writers the Reich had decided were enemies of the people. German prisoners sat in American camp libraries and read books their own government had burned. The letters they were permitted to write home described these conditions. And the letters were censored on the German end, not the American end. The Reich did not want those descriptions arriving in German households. The truth of the camps was its own kind of weapon. But here is where it deepens. Many of the prisoners did not initially interpret their conditions as generosity. They interpreted them as manipulation. The food was too good because America wanted to soften them, to extract information, to use comfort as a tool of intelligence. The books were there to corrupt their ideology. The decency was a trick. It took time, and sometimes it took a very specific, undeniable piece of evidence for that interpretation to loosen its grip. Hit subscribe right now, because what he admitted next changes everything. Do not go anywhere. There is a particular kind of moment that several POW accounts describe, in memoirs and in post-war interviews, and it tends to arrive not dramatically, but quietly, while a man is doing something ordinary. Standing at a window, eating a meal, looking at the horizon from the edge of a camp in the flat middle of America. The moment is the arrival of a number, a real, specific, documented number that the Reich had either hidden from him or told him was Allied propaganda. American industrial production figures were, by the middle of the war, staggering by any honest accounting. In 1944 alone, American factories produced roughly 96,000 aircraft. In a single year. Not a total for the war, a single year. The Focke-Wulf plants, the Messerschmitt lines, the entirety of the German aviation industry, under the pressures of Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not approach that figure. German officers who had access to real Allied production data, and some prisoners, through camp newspapers, Red Cross materials, or conversations with American guards who had no reason to lie, began to encounter it described the experience as something close to physical. One colonel, in a post-war account, described reading an American newspaper article about automobile production that had been converted to war manufacturing, and thinking, simply, we could not have won. There was never a version in which we could have won. He did not say this with grief. He said it with the specific exhausted calm of a man who had carried a wrong answer for a long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. Remember what they believed at the start, that America was soft, that its factories built luxuries, that its people lacked the will for real war? Here is where it breaks. The factories had not been building luxuries. The factories had been building everything. And the workers inside them had been working 3 shifts around the clock in cities these prisoners were now riding past on trains, in a country whose lights were still on, whose children were still in school, whose restaurants were still serving food. The Reich had not hidden America's weakness from them. The Reich had hidden America's strength. There is a specific detail in multiple prisoner accounts that seems small, but carried enormous psychological weight: the American countryside. The men transported by rail through the interior of the country, through the Mississippi Valley, the Great Plains, the ranch lands of Texas, looked out the windows at a landscape of a size and fertility that simply did not match the mental map they had been given. Germany is a nation of perhaps the size of Montana. Its agricultural land is finite, its forests managed to the last tree, its fields worked with the careful intensity of a people who know there is no more land beyond the edge of the map. The Reich had built its entire eastern expansion on the premise that Germany needed more agricultural space, Lebensraum, living room, because what it had was not enough. And these prisoners were passing through a country where the agricultural space appeared from a train window. Have no edge at all. The wheat fields of Kansas alone, visible from a slow-moving rail car, were larger than some of the German territorial gains in the east that had been presented as strategic triumphs. The cattle ranches of Texas were not farms in any sense that corresponded to the German word for farm. The Mississippi River, when they first crossed it. Prompted a quiet recalibration. In several accounts, men had been told about it, but had not understood it, the way one can be told about the ocean, without understanding the ocean, until the moment one stands at its edge. The countryside was not a stage set. There was too much of it, stretching in every direction further than a set designer could plausibly build. And slowly, stubbornly, reluctantly, the understanding arrived. This was the actual country. This was where the food was coming from. This was why the ships were full. The American guards at prisoner of war camps were, by most accounts, neither cruel nor particularly ideological. They were young men from the same towns that prisoners could see from the wire men, who had been farmers and mechanics and students before the uniform. Men who did not think of themselves as representatives of a superpower because they did not use that word and had not been asked to perform that idea. This ordinariness was, for the prisoners, its own kind of revelation. German military culture, especially at the officer level, was deeply formal. Rank was performed. Authority was demonstrated. The distance between a colonel and a private was a social architecture that one inhabited constantly. The American guards were not like this. A prisoner might watch a young American sergeant argue casually with an officer, or see an officer carry his own tray through a mess line, or notice that the relationship between American enlisted men and their superiors was conducted at a temperature that German officers would have considered dangerously close to insubordination. And yet the army that these casual, informal, apparently unmilitary young men belonged to had crossed an ocean, had taken North Africa, had invaded Sicily, had landed at Normandy, had, by the time many of these men arrived in the camps, broken the back of the Wehrmacht in Western Europe. The informality was not weakness. That was the thing that took time to absorb. The informality was simply a different architecture for the same essential seriousness. The Americans did not need to perform authority because the authority was not in question. The country was not in question. The outcome, it turned out, had not really been in question. One does not easily unlearn a belief system in captivity, but one does watch. And what these men watched, day after day, through the wire and across the mess tables, and from the windows of camp libraries, slowly added up to something that the Reich had never prepared them to receive. The open loop planted at the beginning of this story, the prisoner who decided what he was seeing, was a stage set finds its answer not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, grinding accumulation of irrefutable ordinariness. There was no curtain pulled back. There was no confrontation, no argument that broke the last resistance. There was just America, every day, being exactly what it was. Being large and lit and fed and productive and ongoing. Not performing itself, simply existing. For many prisoners, the confession came in letters written home after the war, or in memoirs published in the 1950s and 1960s, or in interviews with historians who had the patience to ask the right questions. It came in sentences carefully constructed to preserve some dignity while admitting the essential thing. Sentences like, "We had not understood what we were fighting," or "The scale of it was not something our maps had prepared us for," or simply, "We were wrong about them." These are not dramatic confessions. They do not have the quality of a Hollywood admission scene. They have the quality of a man in a quiet room, years later, telling a truth he has already told himself 100 times in private. The first telling was the hard one. By the time the memoir was written, it had become simply the truth, the thing that was, the thing he had to account for. The soldiers who came home to Germany after the war's end and the camp's gradual closure repatriation stretched into the late 1940s and even the early 1950s for some, came back to a country that had also, in their absence, been forced to receive the same education. The bombs and the rubble and the occupation had delivered to the German home front the lesson that the prisoners had received more gently, through mess hall food and Kansas wheat fields and camp libraries. The Reich had not understood its enemy. Not the numbers, not the land, not the will, not the factories, not the ships. None of it. The arc of a German prisoner's psychological journey in American captivity follows a shape that historians of the period have documented with some consistency, certainty, then confusion, then rationalization, then the slow, reluctant opening toward reality. The rationalizations were creative. The food was a trick. The countryside was an exception. The production numbers were propaganda. The friendly guards were performing friendliness. Each rationalization required a little more effort than the last, because each day added new evidence to the pile on the other side of the scale. And scales, given enough time and enough weight, tip. What makes these accounts worth telling, what makes the prisoner's perspective, the one that teaches most, is that these men had no stake in flattering America after the fact. A German officer, writing his memoirs in 1958, was not trying to please an American audience. He was trying to make sense of his own experience in a way that would hold up to honest examination. When such a man writes that he had not understood American industrial capacity, he is not paying a compliment. He is making an honest accounting of a mistake that cost his country everything. And the mistake, at its root, was simple, not military, not strategic in the narrow sense. It was the mistake of deciding in advance what an enemy was, and then refusing to update that decision when the evidence began to arrive. The stage set was not in Kansas. The stage set was in the mind of a man who had been told a story and had chosen, because it was more comfortable, to keep believing it. These were men. That is the note this story closes on, and it is not a small one. They were cold and afraid and far from home, held in a country they had been taught to dismiss, finding it instead vast and warm and incomprehensibly alive. Their ideology was wrong. Their cause was catastrophic. The war they served produced suffering on a scale that history has not forgotten and must not forget. And yet the experience of cognitive dissonance, of believing one thing with your whole chest and then being slowly, undeniably shown the opposite, is a human experience. The prisoner who stood at a train window in the summer of 1944 and watched Kansas pass by was not, in that moment, simply a representative of the Reich. He was a man watching the world refuse to be what he had been told it was, and trying to find somewhere inside himself to put that refusal. Some of them found that place. Some of them, in the quiet years after the war, became the men who told their children a different story, not the story of American weakness they had been given, but the story of what they had actually seen. The lights on in the cities, the food in the mess hall, the fields with no visible end, the guards who argued with their officers and still somehow won the war. This is why captured Germans refused to believe they were in America, and this is why, eventually, almost all of them did. The question in the title was never really about geography. It was about what a person can hold in their mind when the evidence begins to pull in a different direction, how long the story you were given can survive contact with the story that is actually true. The prisoners held it as long as they could, and then they let it go. If this kind of history told from the inside, through the eyes of those who lost, with their own words and their own slow admissions, is the kind that stays with you, then stay with us. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. If this one moved you, leave it a like. It helps more people find these stories. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read them. We'll see you in the next one.